Have you ever watched someone's entire world flip upside down in a single moment? Have you ever seen power crumble like dry sand through desperate fingers? What would you do if everything you believed about strength, about worth, about who deserves respect suddenly shattered right in front of your eyes? Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and if this story moves you, hit that subscribe button to support our growth. The marble floor gleamed so bright it looked like frozen water. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like giant diamonds, catching fire from the afternoon sun. The air smelled expensive, thick perfume mixed with leather and something sharp that made your throat feel tight. This was the kind of place where even the silence cost money. Garrett Finch sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's cars. His suit was dark blue, perfectly pressed, with thin silver stripes running down like railroad tracks. His watch caught the light every time he moved his wrist, flashing gold and diamonds. But if you looked close, really close, you could see his left hand trembling, just a little shake, like a leaf before the storm. His face was pale, not the kind of pale you get from staying indoors. This was the pale of someone fighting pain every second. Sweat gathered at his temples even though the room was cool. His jaw was tight, muscles jumping under the skin like trapped animals. Around him stood doctors in white coats, assistants with tablets and worried faces, and business people in expensive suits who pretended not to stare. They whispered to each other, hands covering their mouths, eyes darting between Garrett and the door. "Mr. Finch, we really need to run more tests," a doctor said, his voice careful and soft like he was talking to a sleeping bear. His name tag read Dr. Morrison. He held a clipboard against his chest like a shield. Garrett waved his good hand, the one that didn't shake. "I've had enough tests. 3 hospitals, Morrison, 3, every machine you people have. And what do I get? Nothing. We're not sure, Mr. Finch. It's complicated, Mr. Finch. We need more time, Mr. Finch." His voice grew louder with each word. People stepped back. Even Dr. Morrison flinched. "You know what I think," Garrett continued, his laugh cold and bitter. "I think none of you know what you're doing. I think I've wasted 2 weeks and $500,000 on guesses." The room went silent. Someone's phone buzzed. They quickly silenced it. That's when the door opened. Nobody noticed at first. The door was large and heavy, the kind that moved slow and quiet. Through it stepped a woman in a simple gray dress with a white collar. Her name was Ruth. She had kind eyes that looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of long nights and early mornings. Her hands were rough and red from cleaning chemicals. She carried a cloth bag over her shoulder, faded blue with patches sewn on the corners. Behind her, almost hidden by her shadow, was a boy. His name was Caleb. He was 12 years old but looked smaller. His shirt was faded green, 2 sizes too big, with sleeves that covered his hands unless he pushed them up. His jeans had patches on the knees, stitched carefully with thread that didn't quite match. His shoes were old sneakers, once white, now gray with age, the rubber separating from the fabric at the toes. But his eyes were something else entirely. They were dark and deep, calm like still water. While everyone else in that room looked nervous or proud or worried, Caleb looked peaceful, like he knew something nobody else did. Ruth had been called to clean the private medical wing early. Someone had spilled something in one of the examination rooms. She needed the work, needed every dollar, so she said yes, even though it meant bringing Caleb, because she had nobody to watch him. He had promised to sit quiet, to not touch anything, to be invisible. But Caleb wasn't good at being invisible. "Mama," he whispered, tugging gently on Ruth's sleeve, "that man is hurting." Ruth's eyes went wide. She squeezed his hand hard, the way parents do when they mean stop talking right now asterisk. "Hush, baby, this isn't our place." But Caleb had already seen it. The way Garrett held his left side, the way his breathing came short and sharp, the way pain lived behind his eyes like smoke behind glass. Garrett noticed them then. His gaze moved from Ruth to Caleb, and his face changed. His lips curled just slightly, not quite a smile, something meaner. "You're the cleaning woman," he said, "not a question, a statement." Ruth nodded quickly, her hand tightening on Caleb's. Yes, sir, I was called about the spill in room. And you brought your kid. Garrett's laugh was short and sharp. Perfect, just perfect. I'm surrounded by incompetent doctors, and now we have children running around a medical facility. Heat rushed to Ruth's face. I'm sorry, sir, I'll just. Look at him, someone muttered from the crowd. A woman in a pearl necklace and a suit so white it hurt to look at. He actually thought he was invited. Another voice, male, deep, amused, send him back to the gutter where he belongs. Laughter rippled through the room, not loud, not mean exactly, just casual, like Caleb and Ruth were a joke that wasn't even worth the effort of a real laugh. Caleb felt his mother's hand shaking, saw her shoulders curl forward like she was trying to make herself smaller. He knew that look. He'd seen it before, many times, the look of someone swallowing shame like bitter medicine because they had no choice. Something hot and hard filled Caleb's chest, not anger exactly, something quieter, stronger. Mama's a good person, he said. His voice was small but clear. The room went silent. Garrett turned his full attention to Caleb now, eyebrows raised. What did you say? My mama works hard, Caleb said, his voice steady even though his heart was pounding. She cleans buildings so people like you can work in nice places. She's a good person. For a moment, Garrett just stared. Then he laughed, really laughed this time, throwing his head back even though it made him wince with pain. A good person, he repeated, like the words were funny. Kid, you know what goodness gets you in this world? Nothing, absolutely nothing. You know what gets you something? This. He gestured around the room with his good hand. Money, power, respect, things your mother will never have. Ruth pulled on Caleb's arm. We are leaving, right now. But Garrett wasn't done. He leaned forward in his chair, eyes glittering with something dark and amused. You want to know something else, kid? I'd give $1 million to anyone who could take away this pain. $1 million. He laughed again, sharper this time. But nobody can, not these fancy doctors with their fancy degrees, not anyone. He spread his arms wide, theatrical, mocking. So here's my offer, live and public, heal me, and I'll give you $1 million cash. Right here, right now. The room erupted in nervous laughter. Someone clapped. Dr. Morrison looked at the floor. Heal me for $1 million, Garrett repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Anyone, any takers. The laughter grew louder. People started talking among themselves, shaking their heads, smiling at the ridiculousness of it. Ruth was already moving toward the door, pulling Caleb with her. Her eyes were wet, but she wouldn't let the tears fall. Not here, not in front of these people. But Caleb stopped walking. Mama, he said quietly. No, baby, we're going. Mama, I can help him. Ruth froze, her hand went slack. She turned to look at her son, eyes wide with fear and confusion. What? Caleb looked up at her with those calm, deep eyes. I can help him, Mama, I know I can. Caleb, no, you don't understand. I do understand. His voice was gentle but firm. God showed me, in my dreams, he's been showing me for weeks now, how to help people who hurt. Ruth's breath caught. She knew about the dreams. Caleb had been waking up at night, sitting straight up in bed, hands glowing warm even though the room was cold. He told her things, about neighbors who got better after he prayed for them, about the stray dog with the broken leg that walked fine after Caleb touched it, about feelings in his hands like electricity and warmth flowing through him. She thought it was just imagination, hope, the faith of a child who didn't know how cruel the world could be. But now, looking into his eyes, she wasn't sure. Baby, these people, they'll laugh at you, they'll hurt you with their words. I know, Caleb said simply, but that man is hurting worse, and if I can help I should, right? Isn't that what you taught me? Ruth felt tears sliding down her face now. She couldn't stop them. Her beautiful boy, her brave, impossible boy. Are we interrupting? Garrett's voice cut through their moment, loud and impatient. Because if you're done with your little family moment, I need this room cleared so actual medical professionals can. I'll do it, Caleb said. The room went silent again, but this time the silence was different, heavier, like everyone had taken a breath and forgotten to let it out. Garrett blinked. What? Caleb stepped forward, away from his mother's protective hand. His shoes squeaked slightly on the marble floor. He looked tiny in that big room full of tall people in expensive clothes. "I'll heal you," Caleb said, "for the $1 million, so my mama doesn't have to work so hard anymore." For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then Garrett laughed and laughed and laughed. It wasn't amused laughter anymore. It was the kind of laughter that had edges, that cut, the kind meant to make someone feel small and stupid. "You," Garrett gasped between laughs, "you're going to heal me." The whole room joined in now, not everyone. Dr. Morrison looked uncomfortable. A few of the assistants looked away, but most of them laughed, some hiding their mouths with their hands, others letting it out loud and free. "This is perfect," the woman in the pearl necklace said, wiping her eyes. "A child, a literal child." "Let him try," someone called out. "This I've got to see." "What's he going to do, pray?" another voice added, dripping with mockery. Garrett held up his hand, quieting the crowd. His face was red from laughing, but his eyes were cold and sharp. "All right, kid, I'm a man of my word. You heal me, really heal me, right here, right now, witnessed by all these people, and I'll write you a check for $1 million. He leaned forward, voice dropping low and mean. "But when you fail, and you will fail, I want you and your mother out of this building. Forever. She loses her job. She loses her contract. And everyone here will know exactly what happens when people like you try to reach above your station." Ruth gasped. "No, Caleb, no, we're leaving." But Caleb was already walking forward. His steps were small but steady. The crowd parted, creating a path. Some people smiled, some whispered, some just stared. Caleb stopped in front of Garrett's chair. Up close, the pain was even more obvious. Garrett's face was covered in a thin layer of sweat. His breathing came in short, controlled bursts, like he was trying to hide how much it hurt. His left hand clutched his side, fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his suit. "Where does it hurt?" Caleb asked quietly. Garrett stared at him for a long moment. Then, almost despite himself, he moved his hand slightly, indicating his left side, just below his ribs. "It started 2 weeks ago," Garrett said, his voice different now, quieter. "Like something sharp inside me, gets worse every day. Can't eat, can't sleep. Pain medication barely touches it." Caleb nodded slowly. He closed his eyes. The room watched, silent now. Even the mockers had gone quiet, waiting to see what would happen. Caleb's lips moved in silent words. His hands, small and rough from helping his mother clean, rose slowly. He didn't rush, didn't make it dramatic. He simply reached out and placed 2 fingers against Garrett's wrist. The moment his skin touched Garrett, everything changed. Garrett's entire body went rigid. His eyes flew open wide, so wide the whites showed all around. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Heat, incredible, impossible heat, flooded through his veins like liquid gold. It started at his wrist, where Caleb's fingers rested, then rushed up his arm, across his chest, and dove straight into the center of the pain that had tormented him for 14 days and nights. But it wasn't burning heat. It was the kind of warmth you feel when you step into sunlight after being in the cold too long. The kind that makes your whole body relax, that makes you remember what it feels like to not hurt. Inside Garrett's body, something was happening, something impossible. The doctors couldn't see it, nobody could, but Garrett felt it with crystal clarity. The mass that had been growing in his pancreas, the one the doctors hadn't found yet, the one that would have killed him in 3 months, was dissolving, like ice in hot water, like shadows when you turn on a light. Cell by cell, it came apart. The inflammation surrounding it cooled. Blood vessels that had been compressed and screaming with pain relaxed, opening, flowing free again. Garrett felt his breathing ease, felt the sharp, constant edge of agony that had lived in his side simply stop. Not fade, not lessen. Stop. Like someone had flipped a switch. His hand, the one that had been shaking for days, went completely still. Caleb opened his eyes. He was breathing hard, like he'd been running, sweat beaded on his forehead, but his expression was peaceful. "It's gone," he said simply, then he stepped back. Garrett sat frozen in his chair. His hand moved slowly, almost afraid, to touch his left side. "Nothing." He pressed harder, probed the spot that had made him scream this morning when he tried to shower. "Nothing." He took a deep breath, then another, deeper than he'd breathed in 2 weeks. His lungs filled completely, easily, with no sharp stabbing to stop him halfway. Garrett's voice came out hoarse. He cleared his throat. "I do." He stood up. The movement was smooth, easy, natural. No wincing, no careful shifting of weight. He stood like a man who didn't hurt, because for the first time in 2 weeks, he didn't. The room exploded. "What just happened? Did you see?" "That's not possible. He barely touched him." Dr. Morrison rushed forward, his professional instincts overriding his shock. "Mr. Finch, let me examine." But Garrett waved him off. He was turning slowly, feeling his body, testing it. He bent at the waist, twisted left, then right, movements that would have dropped him to his knees in agony 5 minutes ago. "Nothing." He laughed, but this laugh was different from before. This laugh was breathless, disbelieving, almost frightened. "It's gone," he whispered, then louder, "It's gone." He spun to face Caleb, who stood quietly watching him, hands at his sides. For a long moment, Garrett just stared at this small boy in his oversized shirt and worn shoes. This boy who had just done something impossible. This boy he had mocked, had laughed at, had threatened. This boy who had saved his life. How Garrett's voice failed him, he tried again. "How did you?" But he couldn't finish the question, because he didn't have words for what had just happened. Nobody did. The woman in the pearl necklace had gone pale. The people who had laughed stood silent now, eyes wide, mouths hanging slightly open. Even the assistants with their tablets had stopped pretending to work and were simply staring. Ruth was crying openly now, one hand over her mouth, the other reaching for her son. Caleb walked back to her and took her hand. "Can we go home now, Mama? I'm tired." "Young man." Everyone turned. Garrett's voice was different now, stripped of its arrogance, its mockery, its cruelty. It was the voice of a man who had just touched something beyond his understanding. "You did it," he said quietly. "You actually did it." Caleb nodded. "Yes, sir." "The $1,000,000. Garrett's hand moved to his inside pocket, pulling out a checkbook, his gold pen. "I said I'd pay, and I." "Mr. Finch." Dr. Morrison's voice cut through the moment, urgent and sharp. He had his phone pressed to his ear, his face shocked. "I just got the results from your scan this morning, the one you took before you came here." Everyone froze. Dr. Morrison's hand was shaking as he looked at his phone screen. "The radiologist just called. They found something serious. They want you back immediately for emergency." "What did they find?" Garrett's voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Morrison's eyes moved from the phone to Garrett's face. "A mass on your pancreas, 3 centimeters. They're saying it's likely malignant. They need to operate immediately. They said," his voice dropped, "they said if left untreated, you'd have maybe 3 months." The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Garrett's face had gone from pale to white. His hand reached automatically for his left side, the side that had hurt, the side that was now completely, impossibly pain-free. But Dr. Morrison was scrolling frantically through his phone now. "But you just said the pain is gone. That's not, that does." His voice trailed off as understanding crashed over the room like a wave. "The mass they found this morning. The mass that should be causing Garrett unbearable pain. The mass that should be killing him. Was gone." Dr. Morrison's phone slipped from his hand and clattered on the marble floor. Garrett turned slowly to look at Caleb. The boy stood there, hand in his mother's, looking tired but peaceful, like what had just happened was was the most natural thing in the world. You didn't just take away pain, Garrett whispered. You. He couldn't say it, couldn't put words to it. But everyone in that room knew. This 12-year-old boy in his faded shirt and worn shoes had just healed what doctors couldn't, had just cured what should have been a death sentence, had just done something that would. The room remained frozen in that moment of impossible understanding, everyone trying to process what they had just witnessed, as Caleb stood quietly, simply waiting for his mother to take him home. The silence stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight, ready to snap. Garrett's hand trembled as he stared at Caleb, and for the first time in 20 years, tears gathered in his eyes. Real tears, the kind that burned. He had built an empire on being untouchable, unshakable, but right now he felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, realizing how close he'd come to falling. Dr. Morrison scrambled to pick up his phone, his fingers fumbling over the screen as he pulled up the scan images from this morning. The black and white pictures showed something that looked like a dark shadow on Garrett's pancreas, irregular edges threatening deadly. He held the phone up with shaking hands, showing it to the other doctors in the room, and they all leaned in, faces grave, nodding slowly with the kind of recognition that comes from years of seeing bad news in medical images. "This is aggressive," Dr. Morrison said, his voice professional but strained. "Stage 3, maybe 4. The pain you were experiencing was classic for this type of tumor. The location, the intensity, the progression over 2 weeks, it all matches perfectly." He looked up from the phone, his eyes moving between the screen and Garrett's face, confusion and something like fear making his voice crack. "But you're saying the pain is completely gone, not reduced, but gone?" Garrett didn't answer. He was still staring at Caleb, and slowly, like a man in a dream, he sank back down into his leather chair. His hands gripped the armrest so hard his knuckles turned white. "I felt it," he whispered, and his voice was so quiet that people leaned forward to hear. "I felt something inside me break apart, like ice melting, like something that was hard and wrong just dissolved." The woman in the pearl necklace made a small sound in the back of her throat, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. She pressed her hand to her chest, her perfectly made-up face crumbling. "That's impossible," someone said from the back of the room, but their voice had no strength to it, no conviction, because they had all just watched impossible become real. Ruth pulled Caleb closer, wrapping both arms around him now, protective and fierce. Her son swayed slightly on his feet, exhaustion making his small body tremble. His face had gone pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Whatever he had done, it had cost him something, taken something out of him that a child's body wasn't meant to give. "My baby needs to sit down," Ruth said, her voice cracking with worry and mama bear strength all at once. "He needs water, and he needs to rest." Immediately, 3 assistants rushed forward with chairs and bottles of water, their earlier mockery completely erased, replaced by something that looked like reverence, like fear, like they were suddenly aware they were in the presence of something holy and terrifying. Caleb sat down heavily in the chair they brought, and his small hands shook as he accepted the water bottle. He drank slowly, carefully, and some of the color started to return to his cheeks, but his eyes remained distant, like part of him was still somewhere else, somewhere the rest of them couldn't see. Garrett watched all of this, and something was breaking inside him, something that had been hard and cruel for so long he'd forgotten it could break. He thought about the words he'd said just minutes ago, send him back to the gutter where he belongs. He thought about the laughter, the mockery, the casual cruelty that had seemed so natural, so deserved. He thought about how he'd built his entire life on the belief that money and power made him better than people like Ruth and Caleb, that their poverty was proof of their worthlessness, that his wealth was proof of his superiority. And this child, this poor black boy in his worn shoes and too big shirt, had just saved his life. Had just done what all his money, all his power, all his expensive doctors couldn't do, had just healed him with a touch that lasted 3 seconds and changed everything. "The check," Garrett said suddenly, his voice rough. He pulled out his checkbook again, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. "I promised you $1 million, I'm a man of my word." He started to write, the pen scratching across the expensive paper, but his hand froze halfway through. $1 million. A number that meant everything to Ruth and Caleb, that could change their entire lives, that could buy a house and education and security and freedom from night shifts and worn shoes and too big shirts. But to Garrett, a number that suddenly felt obscenely small. Insulting, even. How do you put a price on your life? How do you pay someone for saving you from death? What's the exchange rate for a miracle? He looked up at Caleb, who was sipping his water quietly, not watching the check, not asking for anything, just trying to recover enough strength to walk. No, Garrett said, and he tore the check in half. Ruth gasped. Several people in the room made sounds of confusion and anger, but Garrett held up his hand, silencing them. 1 million isn't enough, he said, and his voice was stronger now, more certain. It's not even close to enough. You saved my life. You cured cancer that would have killed me in 3 months. You did in 3 seconds what the entire medical establishment couldn't do with all their technology and knowledge. He stood up again, and this time when he moved, there was no pain, no hesitation, just the fluid movement of a healthy body that he'd taken for granted for 47 years until it was threatened. I'm going to set up a trust fund in your name, Garrett said, looking directly at Caleb now. $5 million. For your education, for your future, for whatever you need. And your mother, he turned to Ruth, you'll never have to clean another office again unless you want to. I'm hiring you as the director of my new charitable foundation. Salary, benefits, everything. You'll help me figure out how to use my money to actually help people instead of just making more money. Ruth's legs gave out. She would have fallen if one of the assistants hadn't caught her, getting her to a chair. She sat there, hands over her face, shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and old, from years of struggling and scraping and never having enough, from nights wondering how to pay for Caleb's school supplies and whether the electricity would get shut off and how to make $5 stretch across 3 days until the next paycheck. You don't have to, she whispered through her tears. We don't need. Yes, you do, Garrett interrupted gently. And more importantly, I need to. I need to do this. I need to be someone different than the man I was 10 minutes ago. The man who would have let you walk out of here with nothing, who would have laughed at you and destroyed you just to protect his own ego. He ran his hand through his hair, messing up the perfect styling, and he looked younger suddenly, more human, less like the polished statue of success he'd been performing as for so long. Do you know what I was doing when this pain started 2 weeks ago? Garrett asked, and his voice dropped low, confessional. I was closing a deal that would have put 300 people out of work. Good people, hardworking people with families and mortgages and kids in school. But the numbers made sense, the profit margin was better, so I did it. I signed the papers and I went home and I slept fine because I told myself that's just how business works. That's just reality, survival of the fittest. He laughed, but it was a broken sound. And then I got sick. And all my money, all my power, all my connections couldn't help me. I went to the best hospitals, saw the best doctors, paid for every test and treatment available. Nothing. The pain just got worse. I was dying and I was terrified and I was so angry because how dare my body betray me like this? How dare the universe not recognize how important I am? The room was absolutely silent now. Even the people who had been whispering had stopped. Everyone was listening, watching this powerful man break down and rebuild himself right in front of them. And then you walked in, Garrett said, looking at Caleb again. You, a child, poor black. Everything my world taught me to dismiss, to look down on, to consider less than. And you saved me, not because I deserved it, not because I'd earned it, but because you saw someone hurting and you had the power to help, and so you did. That's it, that simple, that profound. Caleb had finished his water. His color was better now, and his eyes had that clear, focused look again. He looked up at Garrett and spoke for the first time since healing him. My mama taught me that everybody matters, he said, his voice quiet but steady. Rich or poor, nice or mean, everybody's a person and everybody deserves kindness. She said God gave me this gift not to make me special but to help people. And you can't help someone partway. You can't heal someone just a little bit. You either help or you don't. The simplicity of it hit Garrett like a physical blow. You either help or you don't. No calculations about who deserves it, no weighing of worthiness, no exchange of value for value. Just help because someone needs help and you can give it. How old are you? Garrett asked. 12, Caleb answered. 12, Garrett repeated, and he shook his head slowly. When I was 12, I was learning how to cheat on tests and steal lunch money from smaller kids. I was learning that the world rewards the strong and punishes the weak. I was learning to be the man I became. He looked around the room at all the watching faces, at the doctors and assistants and business associates who had laughed along with him earlier, who had joined in his mockery, because that's what you did when you wanted to stay in his good graces. We all were, he said, and there was challenge in his voice now. Every single one of us in this room learned to value money over people, success over kindness, power over compassion. We learned it so well we forgot there was any other way to be, until a 12-year-old boy had to show us. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his face troubled. Mr. Finch, I need to strongly recommend that you still come in for a full examination. What happened here is, I don't have words for what happened here, but we need to verify that the mass is actually gone, that there's no remaining tissue, no risk of recurrence. We need to understand what occurred. Garrett nodded slowly. You're right. Science needs to investigate. Medicine needs to understand. But Morrison, he fixed the doctor with an intense stare, when you write up this case, when you present it to your colleagues, you tell the truth, all of it, that a child healed me with a touch, that it was immediate and complete, that there's no medical explanation. You tell the truth even if it makes you sound crazy, even if they laugh at you, even if it threatens your reputation. You understand. Dr. Morrison swallowed hard, and after a long moment he nodded. I understand. Good. Garrett turned back to Ruth and Caleb. I meant what I said. The trust fund, the job, all of it. I'll have my lawyers draw up the papers tomorrow. But right now, you both should go home. Your son needs rest, and I need time to figure out how to be a different person than I was this morning. Ruth stood up slowly, still looking dazed, like she expected to wake up any moment and find this was all a dream. She took Caleb's hand, and he stood with her, stronger now, more himself. Thank you, Ruth whispered. Thank you for honoring your word. Thank you for raising a son who knows how to be better than me, Garrett replied, and there was no sarcasm in his voice now, no mockery, just honest gratitude and something that looked like grief for all the years he'd wasted being the wrong kind of man. They started walking toward the door, and the crowd parted again, but this time the silence was different. It was respectful, awed, tinged with shame. These people who had laughed and mocked were now watching mother and son leave with something like hunger in their eyes, like they were witnessing something they'd lost long ago and desperately wanted back, but didn't know how to reach for. But just as Ruth's hand touched the door handle, it burst open from the other side. A security guard rushed in, breathless and urgent, followed by two men in dark suits and sunglasses. The kind of men who moved like they'd had military training, who scanned rooms with eyes that missed nothing, who carried themselves with the weight of authority and barely contained violence. Mr. Finch, the security guard panted. These men are from a private medical research facility. They say it's urgent. They say they have information about the boy. One of the suited men interrupted, his voice cold and clipped. He pulled out a badge, official-looking with government seals and clearance levels. I'm Agent Sealers Blackwood, and this is Agent Nolan Pierce. We are with a specialized division that investigates anomalous medical phenomena. We've been tracking reports of unexplained healings across 3 states for the past 18 months. Multiple witnesses, multiple incidents, and every single one leads back to him. He pointed directly at Caleb. The room went cold. Ruth instinctively pulled Caleb behind her, her body becoming a shield, her face transforming from grateful and tired to fierce and protective in an instant. You stay away from my son, she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried a mother's threat, the kind that said she would burn the world down before letting anyone hurt her child. Agent Blackwood held up his hands in a gesture meant to be calming, but came off as patronizing. Mrs. Campbell, we're not here to harm anyone. We are here because your son represents a medical breakthrough that could change the course of human history. His abilities need to be studied, understood, documented. Think of all the people he could help if we could figure out how this works, maybe replicate it, teach it to others. No, Ruth said flatly, my son is not a lab rat. He's not a science experiment. He's a child. A child with extraordinary abilities that he's been using in public. Agent Pierce spoke up now, his voice harder than Blackwood's, less interested in pretending to be friendly. Mrs. Campbell, we have documentation of at least 17 incidents. A woman with stage 4 breast cancer who went into complete remission after your son prayed for her at church. A man with diabetes whose blood sugar normalized instantly. A girl with cerebral palsy who could suddenly walk after your son held her hand at a community center. He pulled out a tablet and started scrolling through files, showing images of people, medical records, testimony. These are just the ones we know about. How many more have there been? How many times has your son altered the course of someone's illness without any medical oversight, without any understanding of long-term effects, without any accountability? Garrett stepped forward, his face darkening. That sounds like you're accusing a child of a crime for helping people. I'm saying that abilities like this need to be monitored, Agent Pierce shot back. For everyone's safety, including the boys. What if his power has side effects he doesn't understand? What if he's damaging himself every time he uses it? What if there are people who would exploit him, use him, hurt him to gain access to what he can do? Ruth's grip on Caleb tightened. Her face had gone pale because she'd had those exact same fears late at night when she couldn't sleep, when she watched her son wake up from dreams glowing with purpose and power that no 12-year-old should have to carry. She'd worried about the cost, about what it took from him, about the day someone with bad intentions might figure out what her boy could do. "We can protect him," Agent Blackwood said, his voice softer again, playing good cop to Pierce's bad. "Our facility is secure, state-of-the-art. He'd be safe there while we study his abilities. And think of the compensation. We're talking about funding that would make Mr. Finch's offer look like pocket change. Your family would be set for life, multiple generations. You'd never have to worry about money again." "We don't want your money," Ruth said, and there was steel in her voice now, the kind forged in years of choosing dignity over comfort, integrity over ease. "And my son's not going anywhere with you." Agent Pierce's jaw tightened. His hand moved almost unconsciously toward his hip, where a gun likely rested under his jacket. "Mrs. Campbell, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. We have legal authority to take custody of your son for national security purposes if we determine his abilities pose a potential threat." "A threat?" Garrett's voice cracked like a whip. "The boy heals people. How in God's name is that a threat?" "Anything we don't understand is a potential threat," Pierce replied, not backing down even though Garrett's face was flushing red with anger. "Anything that can alter human biology at will, that can change the fundamental nature of disease and health, that operates outside the laws of known science. Yes, Mr. Finch, that's absolutely a threat until we understand it." The room had erupted into chaos now. People were shouting, arguing, some agreeing with the agents, some defending Caleb, everyone talking over each other in a cacophony of fear and anger and confusion. Dr. Morrison was on his phone, frantically calling someone. The woman in the pearl necklace was crying again. Several of the business associates had backed toward the exits, not wanting to be part of whatever was about to happen. And in the center of it all stood Caleb, still and quiet, his hand in his mother, his eyes moving from face to face, taking it all in with that calm that seemed impossible for a child who was being threatened with being taken from his home, his mother, everything he knew. "Stop," Caleb said. His voice wasn't loud, but something about it cut through the noise. Something about it made everyone freeze, made the shouting die down to silence, made even the agents turn to look at him with something like wariness in their eyes. "I'm not going with you," Caleb said, looking directly at the agents. "And you can't make me." Agent Pierce's hand definitely moved toward his gun now. "Son, I don't think you understand the situation." "I understand," Caleb interrupted, and for the first time his voice had an edge to it, something sharp and ancient and not quite human that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "You're afraid, you're all afraid. Afraid of something you can't control, can't buy, can't own, can't put in a box and label and make safe. But this isn't about safety, it's about power. You want to study me so you can take what I have and use it for your own purposes. Military purposes, political purposes, money purposes." He took a step forward, and even though he was small and the agents were large and armed and trained, they took a step back. "God gave me this gift to help people who are hurting, not to help governments, not to help corporations, not to make weapons or create super soldiers or cure only the people who can pay for it, to help people. Any people, all people, the way God would want." The lights flickered, just once, just for a second, but everyone noticed, and Caleb's hands hanging at his sides were glowing faintly, a soft golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat, like something alive and aware and watching. "If you try to take me," Caleb said quietly, "I will pray. I will pray that God shows you exactly what it means to face someone under his protection. And I promise you, agents, you don't want that. You really, really don't want that." Agent Blackwood had gone pale. Agent Pierce's hand had moved away from his gun. Both men were staring at Caleb's glowing hands, and whatever they saw in his eyes made them look away, made them take another step back, made them suddenly remember that there were things in this world older and stronger than badges and authority and government power. "We'll be watching," Agent Pierce finally said, his voice not quite as confident as before. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Garrett said, and his voice was calm now, deadly calm, the voice of a man who had built an empire and crushed competitors and knew exactly how to wield power when it mattered. "Because I'm going to make some phone calls tonight, to senators, to congressmen, to judges and lawyers and people who owe me favors going back 20 years. By tomorrow morning, there's going to be so much legal protection around this boy and his mother that if you even think about touching them, you'll spend the rest of your career in court defending why you tried to kidnap a child who heals people. He stepped closer to the agents, close enough that they could see the absolute conviction in his eyes. I spent 47 years using my power for myself. I'm done with that. Now I'm going to use it to protect someone who actually deserves protecting. So you can watch all you want. You can write your reports and file your concerns and do whatever bureaucratic nonsense makes you feel important, but you will not touch him, are we clear? For a long moment nobody moved. Then Agent Blackwood nodded once, sharp and brief. Crystal clear, Mr. Finch, but understand this, abilities like his don't stay secret. Eventually everyone's going to know, and when they do, our legal protection will be the least of your worries. People are going to come from everywhere, desperate, demanding, begging for healing. They're going to tear you apart trying to get to him. He looked at Caleb one more time, and there was something almost like pity in his eyes. You did something beautiful here today, son, but beautiful things in this world have a way of getting destroyed by the people who want to possess them. I hope you're ready for that. And with that, both agents turned and walked out, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor, the door closing behind them with a heavy, final sound. The room remained frozen for several heartbeats. Then Ruth collapsed into a chair, her whole body shaking, adrenaline and terror and relief crashing through her all at once. Caleb's hands stopped glowing, and he swayed on his feet again, the exhaustion returning twice as strong, like whatever he'd done to make those agents back down had cost him even more than the healing. "Mama," he whispered, and then his eyes rolled back and his legs gave out. Ruth screamed and lunged for him, but Garrett was faster, catching the boy before he hit the floor, cradling him carefully, shocked by how light he was, how fragile, how young. "Get Dr. Morrison." Garrett shouted, and the doctor was already there, fingers on Caleb's neck checking his pulse, pulling out a small flashlight to check his pupils. "His pulse is weak but steady," Dr. Morrison said quickly. "He's not unconscious, just exhausted. Whatever energy he's using when he heals, it's taking everything out of him." He looked up at Ruth with concern. "Has this happened before?" "Twice," Ruth admitted, tears streaming down her face. "Once after he healed our neighbor's daughter who had pneumonia. Once after he helped an old man at church who was having a heart attack. Both times he collapsed after, slept for almost a full day. I tried to make him stop, tried to tell him he was hurting himself, but he said people needed help, and he couldn't ignore that." Garrett carried Caleb to the leather chair and laid him down gently, the same chair where he'd been sitting just 30 minutes ago, laughing at this boy, mocking him, threatening him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He needs rest, proper medical monitoring, and honestly, probably about 3,000 calories to replenish whatever he's burning through, Dr. Morrison said. He looked at Garrett. "I'm saying this as his doctor right now, not yours. This boy cannot keep doing this. His body isn't developed enough to handle this kind of energy expenditure. If he keeps healing people at this rate, especially severe cases like yours, it could cause permanent damage, heart problems, neurological issues, stunted growth. His gift is real, but it's using up resources his body needs to grow and develop." Ruth was beside the chair now, holding Caleb's hand, stroking his hair, whispering prayers and reassurances. "I'll make him stop," she said fiercely. "I'll lock him in the house if I have to. I'm not losing my baby to this." "You can't make him stop," Garrett said quietly, and when Ruth looked up at him with anger flashing in her eyes, he held up his hand. "I'm not saying don't try. I'm saying I know that look in his eyes. That's the look of someone who's found their purpose. People like that don't stop just because it's hard or dangerous. They can't. It's not in them." He smiled sadly. "Trust me, I know. I had that same look when I built my first company. Nothing could have stopped me. Not poverty, not failure, not people telling me it was impossible. The difference is, my purpose was selfish and his is selfless, but the drive is the same." Ruth wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the unfairness of a world that would give her precious son a gift that might destroy him, but deep down she knew Garrett was right. She'd seen Caleb's face when he helped people, seen the joy and peace and absolute certainty that this was what he was meant to do. You couldn't stop that any more than you could stop the sun from rising. "Then what do we do?" she asked, and her voice broke on the question. Garrett looked around the room at all the watching faces, at the doctors and assistants and witnesses who had seen everything tonight, who would go home and tell people, who would spread the story until it grew wings and flew far beyond this building, this city, this moment. We protect him, Garrett said finally. We build something around him that lets him do what he's meant to do but keeps him safe while he does it. A foundation, maybe, proper medical oversight, security, legal protection. We make it so he can help people without destroying himself in the process. He looked down at Caleb's sleeping face, peaceful now despite everything. And we make sure the world knows that this boy is not for sale, not for study, not for exploitation. He's just a kid who can do something amazing, and he deserves to grow up normal and safe and loved while he figures out what that means. Ruth searched Garrett's face, looking for lies or manipulation or hidden agendas, but all she saw was sincerity and determination and the changed heart of a man who'd been given a second chance at life and was desperate not to waste it. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, but he comes home with me tonight, and every night. He sleeps in his own bed, eats at his own table, lives his own life. Whatever we build, it doesn't take him away from being my son. That's non-negotiable." "Agreed," Garrett said immediately. "I'll have my people start making arrangements tomorrow, but tonight, let me at least send you home in my car with security. Those agents aren't the only people who might have heard about what happened here." "And Ruth," he waited until she looked at him, "I meant what I said about the job and the money, not as payment for healing me, but as investment in making sure you have the resources to protect and support your son in whatever comes next." Before Ruth could respond, Caleb stirred. His eyes fluttered open, still tired but aware. He looked up at his mother and smiled weakly. "I'm okay, Mama, just sleepy." "You scared me half to death, baby," Ruth said, hugging him carefully. "You can't keep doing that. You can't keep pushing yourself until you collapse." "I know," Caleb said softly, "but Mama, did you see? Mr. Finch doesn't hurt anymore, and those agents, they left. And everyone here," his eyes moved around the room, "they're different now. They were one way before and now they're different. That's worth being tired for." Out of the mouths of babes, Garrett thought, and he felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. Hope, maybe, or purpose that wasn't about money and power, or just the simple joy of knowing that the world could change, that people could change, that even someone as lost as he'd been could find a path back to being human. "Come on," Garrett said. "Let's get you both home. Tomorrow we'll start figuring everything else out, but tonight you need rest and your mama needs to stop worrying herself sick." He helped Caleb stand, and Ruth supported him from the other side, and together they walked toward the door. The crowd parted again, but this time people reached out, not to grab or demand or take, but to touch gently, to whisper thank you, to look at Caleb with something like wonder and gratitude and apology all mixed together. Woman in the pearl necklace stepped forward, and her face was different now, softer, younger somehow despite her age. She took off her necklace, real pearls, probably worth tens of thousands of dollars, and tried to hand it to Ruth. "Please," she said, "for what your son did, for showing us." Ruth shook her head gently. "We don't need pearls, ma'am, but if you want to do something, there's a food bank on 5th Street that's always running short. Maybe donate there, help some people who are hungry." "That would mean more than jewelry." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded quickly, clutching the pearls to her chest. "I will, I promise I will." And as Garrett led Ruth and Caleb out of that room, out into the quiet hallway where his driver was already waiting with the car, as they settled into leather seats that probably cost more than Ruth's monthly rent, as the city lights blurred past the windows on the drive to Ruth's small apartment in a neighborhood Garrett had never visited and had always dismissed, something fundamental had shifted in the universe. A boy who should have been powerless had proven he was anything but. A man who thought he was invincible had learned he was mortal and been saved by the person he'd mocked. And a mother who'd spent years being invisible had stood up to government agents and billionaires and refused to let her son be taken or used or destroyed. None of them knew what tomorrow would bring, what challenges waited, what the agents had meant when they said everyone would come for Caleb once word spread. But for tonight, in the quiet darkness of the car, with Caleb's head resting on his mother's shoulder and Garrett sitting across from them, seeing them not as the help or the poor or the lesser, but as the people who had saved his life and changed his soul, there was peace, and that was enough. 3 months had passed since that day in the medical wing, and the world had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The story had spread like wildfire, just as Agent Blackwood had warned, starting with whispers among the medical staff, then posts on social media from people who'd been in that room, then news articles with headlines that screamed, "Miracle Boy Heals Dying Millionaire," and "Child Performs Impossible Medical Cure." Within a week, Ruth's phone number had been leaked somehow, and it rang day and night with desperate voices begging for help, offering money, threatening legal action, crying and pleading and demanding, until Ruth had to change her number 3 times and finally just threw the phone away entirely. People camped outside their apartment building, some sick and desperate, some just curious, some with cameras and microphones trying to get the story, and it got so bad that Garrett had to hire private security and eventually moved Ruth and Caleb to a safe house in a gated community where reporters couldn't follow and desperate families couldn't bang on the door at 3 in the morning. The Caleb Campbell Foundation had been established with Garrett as chairman and Ruth as executive director, and they'd spent those 3 months building something unprecedented, a medical facility that combined cutting-edge technology with what Caleb could do, a place where people could come for help, but under controlled conditions that wouldn't destroy Caleb's health or childhood in the process. Dr. Morrison had joined them, fascinated and humbled and determined to understand the science behind what Caleb did, even though every test they ran came back impossible, showing energy readings that shouldn't exist and biological changes that violated everything medical science understood about how bodies worked. They'd had to turn away thousands of people, which broke Caleb's heart every single time, because there were too many sick people in the world and only one 12-year-old boy who couldn't heal them all without dying himself. So they'd created a system, a lottery combined with medical triage, where the most critical cases got priority, and Caleb worked 3 days a week for 4 hours maximum, healing as many as he could before exhaustion made his hands shake and his vision blur. Today was one of those days, and the waiting room of the foundation building was filled with people whose lives hung by threads so thin that conventional medicine had given up on them. Garrett stood at the observation window looking down at the treatment room where Caleb sat in a comfortable chair designed specifically for him, pediatric-sized with supports that would catch him if he collapsed. And across from him sat a woman named Vera, who was 43 years old and had been given 2 weeks to live because her kidneys had failed, and she wasn't a candidate for transplant due to complications from lupus that had ravaged her body for 15 years. Vera's husband held her hand and cried silent tears while Caleb placed his small fingers on her wrist, closed his eyes, and that now familiar golden glow began to emanate from his skin, pulsing with rhythm like a heartbeat, warm and bright and impossible. Garrett watched the monitors that Dr. Morrison had insisted on installing, watched as Vera's vital signs shifted, her kidney function readings that had been flatlined suddenly spiking upward, her blood chemistry normalizing in real time, her body essentially rewriting itself at the cellular level in defiance of every law of biology. It took 3 minutes this time, longer than usual, and when Caleb opened his eyes he was pale and shaking but smiling because Vera was sitting up straighter, breathing easier, color returning to her face as her husband gasped and Dr. Morrison rushed in with portable equipment to verify what the monitors were already showing. Complete remission, organs functioning normally, lupus markers gone from her bloodstream like they'd never existed. "How do you feel?" Dr. Morrison asked Vera. Professional, even though his hands trembled slightly with awe he couldn't quite hide anymore, and Vera touched her face, her arms, her chest where pain had lived for so long, and she started laughing and crying at the same time, and her husband pulled her into his arms, and they held each other while their whole world rebuilt itself around the miracle of simply being able to live. Caleb slumped back in his chair, accepting the juice and protein bar that Ruth immediately provided, and Garrett saw the exhaustion in the boy's eyes, the deep weariness that came from giving pieces of yourself away day after day, even when it cost you something essential. They'd done 7 healings today already, and Vera made 8, and Dr. Morrison had said 8 was the absolute maximum before they risked serious damage to Caleb's still developing system. So this would be the last one, and Ruth was already preparing to take Caleb home, where he'd sleep for 14 hours straight and wake up still tired, but ready to do it all again in 2 days. Garrett turned away from the window and nearly collided with Agent Blackwood, who had become a semi-regular presence at the foundation despite Garrett's legal efforts to keep government oversight at bay. Because some battles you couldn't win with lawyers and money, and the agents had settled into an uneasy détente where they observed but didn't interfere as long as strict protocols were followed. "Impressive as always," Blackwood said, and there was genuine respect in his voice now, though Garrett never fully trusted it. 8 in one session, that's a new record. "It's too many," Garrett replied flatly. "Morrison says we need to cut it back to 6 maximum. The boys' exhaustion levels are getting dangerous." "The boys saving lives," Blackwood countered. "There are currently 6,000 people on the waiting list, Finch. 6,000 verified cases of terminal illness, and that number grows every day. You're helping maybe 100 people a month when you could be helping thousands if you just let us study him properly, figure out how to enhance or replicate what he does." Garrett's jaw tightened. "We've had this conversation. The answer is still no. Caleb is not a lab experiment, and whatever he does comes from something you can't replicate in a laboratory because it's not just biology, it's something else, something spiritual that your machines can't measure." "Everything can be measured," Blackwood insisted. "Everything follows rules, even miracles. We just have to find the right instruments." "Or," Garrett said quietly, "you have to accept that some things aren't meant to be controlled or commodified or turned into weapons, which is what you'd ultimately do with this if we let you." Blackwood's expression hardened. "You think pretty highly of yourself for a man who was ready to mock and destroy this boy 3 months ago. Don't forget I read the initial reports, Finch. I know exactly what you said to him, how you treated him and his mother. You're not some noble protector, you're a guilty man trying to buy redemption." The words hit harder than Garrett wanted to admit, cutting straight to the truth he carried with him every day, the shame of who he'd been, and the fear that no amount of money or protection or good works would ever fully erase the cruelty of that first meeting. "You're right," Garrett said, surprising Blackwood into silence. "I was that man. I said those things. I laughed at a child and threatened his mother and treated them like garbage because I'd spent my whole life believing that money made me better than people who didn't have it. And you know what? That makes me exactly the right person to protect Caleb now because I understand how people like I used to be think. I know how they'll try to use him, exploit him, justify taking a child's freedom for the greater good." He stepped closer to Blackwood, voice dropping low and intense. "I know because I would have done it myself 3 months ago if it had served my interests. So yeah, I'm guilty and I'm trying to buy redemption, but that doesn't make me wrong about keeping him safe from people who see him as a resource instead of a person." Before Blackwood could respond, alarms started blaring throughout the building, harsh and urgent, and security personnel were suddenly running through the hallways with weapons drawn, shouting into radios about a breach at the north entrance. Garrett's heart seized with immediate fear, and he sprinted toward the treatment room where Caleb was, Blackwood right behind him, both men's differences forgotten in the face of potential danger. They burst into the room to find Ruth already shielding Caleb with her body, Dr. Morrison standing protectively in front of them both, and the security team forming a perimeter around the door. Through the windows that looked out onto the Foundation's main entrance, Garrett could see chaos, hundreds of people, maybe thousands, pressing against the gates and walls, some sick and in wheelchairs, some carrying signs that read "Heal my child," and "We have the right to live," and "Save us." And at the front of the crowd was a man Garrett recognized from news reports. A charismatic preacher named Elias Stone, who'd built a megachurch empire on promises of faith healing and prosperity gospel, and who had been vocally critical of Caleb, calling him everything from a fraud to a demon to a false prophet stealing glory that should belong to God alone. Elias held a megaphone, and his voice boomed across the property, amplified and righteous and furious. "You cannot keep God's gift locked away behind gates and security and appointment systems. You cannot decide who lives and who dies based on your lottery and your protocols. This boy was given power from on high to heal the sick, and you've turned it into a business, into an exclusive club where only the chosen few get saved while the rest of us suffer and die." The crowd roared their agreement, a sound like thunder, angry and desperate and dangerous, and Garrett saw people climbing the gates, saw others trying to force their way through, saw security struggling to hold the line without hurting anyone because these weren't criminals or terrorists. They were sick people and their families who had run out of options and hope and were willing to do anything, risk anything, for a chance at survival. "We need to evacuate," Blackwood said urgently, already on his radio calling for federal backup. Get the boy out through the underground exit now before this turns into a full-scale riot. But Caleb stood up, pushing past his mother's protective arms, and his face held that expression Garrett had come to recognize, the look of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be moved from it. "No," Caleb said quietly, "I'm not running away." "Baby, it's not safe," Ruth pleaded, trying to pull him back. "Those people are out of control. They could hurt you. They're not out of control, Mama. They're dying." Caleb walked to the window and looked out at the sea of desperate faces, at children in their parents' arms too sick to stand, at elderly people being held up by family members, at young people who should have had whole lives ahead of them, but instead had been handed death sentences by diseases that didn't care about fairness or justice. "They're dying and they know I can help, and we're telling them no. How is that right? Because you can't help everyone." Dr. Morrison said, his voice breaking with frustration and compassion. "Caleb, we've been over this. Your body has limits. If you try to heal all those people, you'll die. You understand that? The energy expenditure would literally kill you." "Maybe," Caleb said softly, "or maybe I've been holding back because I'm afraid, because everyone keeps telling me I have to protect myself. But what if that's not what this gift is for? What if I'm supposed to give everything, not just some carefully measured amount?" Garrett felt ice form in his chest. "No, absolutely not. We're not having this conversation. You're 12 years old, Caleb. You don't get to decide to martyr yourself. But I do get to decide how to use what God gave me," Caleb replied, and his voice was still gentle, but there was steel underneath it, conviction that couldn't be argued away. "You all keep trying to make me safe, to make this sustainable, to turn it into something that fits into normal rules. But it's not normal and it's not supposed to be safe. It's supposed to help people." He turned to face them all, his mother, Garrett, Dr. Morrison, Agent Blackwood, the security team, and his eyes held that ageless quality again, that sense of something older and wiser looking out through a child's face. "I've been having dreams," he said, "every night for the past week. In the dreams, I'm standing in a field and there are people everywhere, as far as I can see, and they're all sick and hurting and calling out for help. And in the dream, I try to heal them one at a time like we do here, but there are too many and I'm too slow and people keep dying while they wait. But then in the last dream, something changed. I stopped trying to protect myself and I just opened up, let everything flow out, and light came from my hands like a river, like a flood, and it washed over everyone at once and they were all healed, all of them." Ruth was crying now, shaking her head in denial. "Those are just dreams, baby. Just your mind trying to make sense of an impossible situation. They don't mean you should actually. They're not just dreams, Mama, they're instructions." Caleb walked to the door and placed his small hand on it, and even through the metal and security locks, everyone could feel warmth radiating from his palm. "I'm going out there. You can try to stop me, lock me in, take me away somewhere they can't find me. But if you do that, I'll just find another time, another place. Because this is what I'm meant to do." Garrett wanted to argue, wanted to use his authority and resources and power to prevent this, to protect this boy who'd saved his life and changed his heart. But he saw in Caleb's eyes the same unstoppable determination he'd once felt building his empire, except purified, sanctified, aimed at something infinitely better than profit margins and market dominance. "If you do this," Dr. Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion, "if you try to heal that many people at once with no limits, I can't predict what will happen. It could work exactly like your dream. Or it could stop your heart, burn out your nervous system, cause a stroke or seizure. You could end up brain dead or paralyzed or," he couldn't finish, couldn't say the word dead when talking about a child he'd come to care for. "I know the risks," Caleb said simply. "But Dr. Morrison, you've seen my test results. You told me yourself that what I do violates every biological law you know, so maybe normal limits don't apply. Maybe if I trust God completely instead of holding back out of fear, something different happens, something bigger." Blackwood stepped forward, and for once his federal agent mask had slipped, showing genuine concern underneath. "Kid, even if you survive this physically, think about the psychological cost. You're 12. You should be playing video games and complaining about homework, not carrying the weight of thousands of lives on your shoulders. That kind of responsibility destroys adults. What do you think it'll do to a child?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted, and finally he looked scared, young, uncertain. "I'm afraid too. Afraid it won't work, afraid it will hurt, afraid of what happens after even if I survive. But I'm more afraid of doing nothing, of playing it safe while people die. Of wasting this gift God gave me because I was too scared to really use it." He looked at his mother, and fresh tears spilled down Ruth's face because she saw her baby boy, her precious child who still needed her to cut his sandwiches into triangles and check for monsters under the bed. But she also saw something she'd been trying to deny, that Caleb had been chosen for something she couldn't control or prevent, that some children were born for ordinary lives and some for extraordinary sacrifice. And fighting against that was like fighting against the tide or the wind or the turning of the earth itself. "If you die," Ruth whispered, "I die too, you understand that? If I lose you, I lose everything that matters." Caleb crossed the room and hugged his mother, and he felt so small in her arms, so fragile, and Ruth wanted to grab him and run and keep running until they found someplace in the world where sick people wouldn't find them and her son could just be a kid. "You won't lose me, Mama," Caleb said against her shoulder. "I promise. God didn't give me this gift just to take me away from you. He's got a plan, and we have to trust it even when it's scary." Garrett cleared his throat roughly, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring anymore who saw him cry. "If we're doing this, and apparently we are because nobody in this room can actually stop you, then we're doing it with medical support. Morrison, get every crash cart, every monitor, every piece of emergency equipment we have. Blackwood, your federal backup can actually be useful for once and help manage the crowd, keep it from turning into a stampede. And Ruth," he looked at the mother who'd raised this impossible, beautiful, terrifying child, "you stay close to him. If anything goes wrong, if he shows any sign of distress, you grab him and we abort immediately." Agreed. Ruth wanted to say no, wanted to refuse to be part of this insanity, but she knew Caleb well enough to know that he'd do it with or without their support, and at least this way they could try to protect him as much as possible. "Agreed," she whispered. The next 20 minutes were organized chaos as the Foundation's staff prepared for something unprecedented, setting up medical equipment on the front lawn, coordinating with Blackwood's federal team to create barriers that would allow people through in waves instead of all at once, and trying to explain to Elias Stone and the crowd leaders what was about to happen without triggering a panic or a rush. When everything was as ready as it could be, Caleb walked out the front door of the Foundation and into the afternoon sunlight, and the crowd noise immediately dropped to an eerie silence as thousands of eyes fixed on the small boy in his simple jeans and t-shirt, the boy they'd pinned all their desperate hopes on. Elias Stone stood at the front of the crowd, and up close, Garrett could see that behind the preacher's righteous anger was genuine desperation. His own daughter was in a wheelchair beside him, maybe 16 years old, her body wasted by muscular dystrophy, and suddenly Garrett understood that this wasn't just about theology or control, but about a father who would do anything, even storm a secure facility, to save his child. "You said I can't keep God's gift locked away," Caleb said to Elias, his young voice carrying clearly in the silence. "You're right, so I'm not going to. Everyone who's sick, everyone who's hurting, I'm going to try to help all of you at once. I don't know if it'll work, I don't know if I'm strong enough, but I'm going to try because that's what this gift is for." Elias stared at him, anger draining from his face, replaced by something like shock and hope and fear. "Boy, that's thousands of people." "You can't, I know I can't," Caleb interrupted gently, "but God can, so I'm just going to open up and let him work through me and trust that he knows what he's doing even if I don't." He walked to the center of the lawn where Dr. Morrison had set up a clear space, and Ruth walked beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and Garrett and Morrison and Blackwood formed a protective circle around them while security held the crowd at a careful distance. Caleb closed his eyes and took a deep breath, and everyone watching saw his hands begin to glow, that golden light that had become familiar to the Foundation staff but was new and miraculous to the crowd, causing gasps and cries and prayers to ripple through the thousands gathered. But this time, the light didn't stay contained in his hands. It spread up his arms, across his chest, until Caleb's entire body was luminous, glowing so bright that people had to shield their eyes, and the light kept growing, expanding, pulsing outward in waves that washed over the crowd like a visible wind. Dr. Morrison watched his monitors in disbelief as Caleb's vital signs spiked to levels that should have been fatal. Heart rate at 200, blood pressure through the roof, brain activity showing patterns that looked like seizures, except Caleb was standing steady and calm, his face peaceful even as his body blazed with impossible light. The light touched the first row of people and they gasped, some falling to their knees, because they felt it, heat and electricity and love all mixed together, flowing through them like liquid gold, finding every place of sickness and pain and damage, and rewriting it, correcting it, healing it at the cellular level. Elia's daughter screamed, but it wasn't a scream of pain. It was wonder and shock because her muscles were strengthening, her wasted limbs filling out, her body that had been betraying her for 16 years suddenly remembering how to work properly. And she stood up from her wheelchair on legs that had been useless for 5 years, and they held her weight, and she was crying and laughing, and her father was holding her, and they were both sobbing with joy that hurt because it was too big to contain. The light kept spreading, row after row, hundreds of people touched simultaneously, and everywhere it went miracles followed, tumors dissolving, infections burning away, damaged organs regenerating, blind eyes opening, deaf ears hearing. Paralyzed limbs moving, chronic pain vanishing like it had never existed. An old man with Alzheimer, who hadn't recognized his wife in 3 years, suddenly looked at her with clear eyes and said her name. A child with leukemia felt the disease die in her blood and her body begin to rebuild healthy cells. A young woman with HIV felt the virus simply cease to exist, her immune system restored and strong. Over and over, impossible healings repeated across the crowd, and the silence broke into shouts and songs and prayers, people praising God and crying and holding each other and trying to process the fact that they'd been dying and now they weren't, that they'd been broken and now they were whole. But Garrett watched Caleb and felt terror override his awe because the boy's body was shaking now, trembling with the effort of channeling this much power, and blood had started trickling from his nose, and his breathing was labored like his lungs were fighting for every breath. "It's too much," Dr. Morrison said urgently, checking his monitors with shaking hands. "His system can't take this. We need to stop. We can't stop," Ruth said, and her voice was anguished but certain. "Look at him. He's not going to stop. He won't." And she was right. Caleb's eyes were still closed, his face still peaceful despite the physical strain, and the light kept pouring out of him in endless waves, reaching further and further into the crowd, touching people in the back rows who'd thought they'd never get close enough, healing the security guards who'd been watching in amazement, even reaching some of the federal agents, including Blackwood himself, who felt old injuries and damage from his years in service simply vanish. The light spread beyond the foundation grounds, flowing out into the surrounding neighborhood, where people who hadn't even known about the gathering suddenly felt warmth and healing wash over them. An elderly woman in her apartment 3 blocks away felt her arthritis disappear. A homeless man sleeping in an alley felt his cirrhosis reverse itself. A nurse working in a hospital nearby felt her chronic migraines cease forever. For 3 blocks in every direction, sickness and pain and damage were simply erased, touched by light that shouldn't exist, channeled through a boy who shouldn't be able to do what he was doing, and it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Garrett had ever witnessed. Then Caleb's legs gave out. He collapsed forward and Garrett caught him, feeling how the boy's body was burning with fever, how his heart was racing erratically, how he was barely conscious. "Caleb!" Ruth screamed, dropping to her knees beside them. "Baby, talk to me." Dr. Morrison was there immediately, checking pulse and breathing and pupils while shouting for his medical team to bring equipment. "He's in shock. Severe dehydration, possible cardiac arrhythmia, temperature at 104 and rising. We need to get him inside now, start IV fluids, get his temperature down before he has a seizure." They lifted Caleb carefully and rushed him back into the foundation, while the crowd watched in stunned silence, their joy at being healed now mixed with horror at what it had cost the boy who'd saved them. In the emergency medical room they'd built specifically for situations like this, Dr. Morrison and his team worked with controlled urgency, getting IV lines in, applying cooling measures, administering medications to stabilize Caleb's heart and bring his fever down, while Ruth held his hand and prayed in a whisper that was half prayer and half desperate begging for God to not take her son, to not let this gift kill him, to please, please let him be okay. Garrett stood back, feeling useless and helpless, watching this child who'd saved his life now fighting for his own, and he thought about how 3 months ago he would have laughed at this boy, dismissed him, hurt him with words and arrogance, and now he would give everything he owned, every dollar and asset and piece of power, if it would help Caleb survive this. Hours passed. Caleb's fever slowly came down. His heart rhythm stabilized. His breathing eased from desperate gasps to something more normal. As night fell and monitors beeped steadily, showing vital signs that were finally normalizing, Dr. Morrison allowed himself to exhale. "He's going to make it," Morrison said quietly. "I don't know how, but he's going to make it." Ruth collapsed in her chair, every ounce of strength leaving her body at once, and she cried with the kind of relief that hurts worse than grief, because it's the flip side of terror, the knowledge of how close you came to losing everything. Garrett stepped outside the medical room and found Agent Blackwood waiting, and the federal agent looked different, softer somehow, shaken. "Preliminary reports are coming in," Blackwood said quietly. "We are estimating somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people were healed today. Complete remission in cases that were terminal. Regeneration of organs that were damaged beyond repair. Reversal of genetic conditions that aren't supposed to be curable." And the range, we're getting reports from people who weren't even at the foundation, people 3 blocks away who suddenly found themselves healed of chronic conditions without knowing why. He ran his hand through his hair, looking lost. "Finch, I've spent my career investigating anomalous phenomena, looking for rational explanations, trying to categorize and control things that don't fit normal paradigms. But this, there's no containing this, no explaining it. That boy just performed the largest mass healing in recorded human history, and I watched him almost die doing it, and I don't know what any of this means anymore. It means some things are bigger than our ability to understand or control them," Garrett said. "It means there's still mystery and miracle in the world, even though we've tried to eliminate both with science and skepticism. And it means that boy in there is precious and special and deserves to be protected, not studied like a lab specimen." Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "The official report will say that a spontaneous mass remission event occurred, cause unknown. The government will not pursue further investigation of Caleb Campbell's abilities. He's just a kid, and he deserves to be left alone." He looked Garrett directly in the eyes. "I'm sorry it took watching him almost die for me to understand what you've been trying to tell me all along." 3 days later, Caleb woke up in his own bed, in the apartment that Ruth had refused to leave despite Garrett's offers of luxury accommodations, because home was home, and after everything they'd been through, she needed the familiar comfort of their small space and their own things. Caleb opened his eyes to find his mother asleep in a chair beside his bed, and Garrett asleep in another chair by the window, both of them having refused to leave his side, and the morning sun was streaming through the curtains, making everything golden and warm. "Mama," Caleb said quietly, and Ruth's eyes flew open immediately, maternal instinct sharper than any alarm. "Baby." She was beside him instantly, touching his face, checking his forehead for fever, searching his eyes for signs of damage or pain. "How do you feel? Does anything hurt? Dr. Morrison said you should sleep for at least another day." "I'm okay, Mama," Caleb said, and his voice was tired but steady. "Just hungry, really, really hungry." Ruth laughed through fresh tears, and she hugged him carefully, and Garrett woke up to the sound of her laughter and saw Caleb awake, and felt relief so profound it made his chest ache. "You scared us half to death, kid," Garrett said, trying to sound stern but failing completely. "Scared yourself too, I hope, because we're implementing strict protocols now, no more healing thousands of people at once, no more pushing yourself to the edge of death, understood?" Caleb smiled weakly. "Understood. I don't think I could do that again even if I wanted to. It took everything I had and then some." "What made you think you could?" Garrett asked gently. "What made you believe you survived something that should have killed you?" Caleb thought about that, his young face serious. "I didn't believe I'd survive, exactly. I just believed that if I was supposed to die doing it, God would take care of my mama after. And if I wasn't supposed to die, then he'd get me through it. Either way, I trusted him more than I trusted my fear." Such simple faith from such a young soul, Garrett thought, and he wondered what the world would look like if adults could hold on to even a fraction of that kind of trust, instead of drowning in cynicism and doubt and the need to control everything. Over the next weeks, the world did change. News of the mass healing spread globally. Investigated by journalists and scientists and skeptics who all came to the same impossible conclusion. Thousands of people had been spontaneously cured of terminal and chronic illnesses in a single afternoon, and there was no rational explanation except the presence of a 12-year-old boy who could do things that violated every known law of medicine and physics. Some people called it the greatest miracle of the modern age. Others called it mass hysteria or placebo effect, though they could never quite explain how placebo cured cancer or regenerated organs. Religious leaders debated whether Caleb was blessed or dangerous, whether his gift came from God or something darker, and churches split over whether to embrace or reject what he represented. But for Caleb and Ruth and Garrett, life slowly found a new rhythm. The foundation continued its work on a much more restricted schedule, helping people at a pace that wouldn't destroy Caleb's health. Garrett dismantled large portions of his business empire, redistributing wealth to charitable causes and setting up systems to help people in need. Ruth found joy in her new role, using her position to advocate for the poor and marginalized, bringing their voices into rooms where decisions were made. And Caleb went back to school, did his homework, played with friends, and lived as normal a life as possible for a child who'd performed miracles. On weekends, he still healed people, but carefully now with limits and support and rest. He'd learned that martyrdom wasn't the goal, sustainable service was, that he could help more people over a lifetime of careful healing than in one spectacular sacrifice, that being faithful meant being wise, not just brave. 5 years passed. Caleb turned 17, taller now but still carrying that calm in his eyes, that peace that came from knowing his purpose. The foundation had helped over 3,000 people, changing their lives and the lives of everyone who loved them. Garrett had become a different man entirely, using his wealth and influence to fight injustice and create opportunity. Ruth had become a powerful advocate, respected and influential in ways she'd never imagined possible. And on the anniversary of that day, when Caleb had healed thousands, they held a gathering at the foundation where people whose lives had been touched came to celebrate and remember. Elias Stone was there with his daughter, who'd graduated high school and was now in college studying to become a doctor. Vera was there with her husband, healthy and strong and volunteering at the foundation twice a week. Hundreds of others filled the grounds, living proof that miracles happened and love was real, and sometimes the world did change for the better. Caleb stood at the front and spoke briefly, his 17-year-old voice deeper but still gentle. 5 years ago, I almost died trying to help all of you at once, and I learned that God doesn't usually ask us to burn ourselves out in one spectacular moment. He asks us to show up day after day, to help where we can, to love consistently, to be faithful in small things that add up to big change. The miracle wasn't just the healing, it was all of us learning to be better, to care more, to use what we have to help each other. He looked at Garrett, who'd become like a father to him, at his mother, who'd never stopped being his anchor, at Dr. Morrison and Agent Blackwood and all the others who'd been transformed by witnessing the impossible. We are all healers in our own way, Caleb said. Maybe not with our hands like I can, but with our choices, our compassion, our willingness to see people who are hurting and actually do something about it. That's the real miracle, not just that bodies get healed, but that hearts do too. As the sun set over the foundation that day, painting everything golden and warm, Garrett thought about the man he'd been, arrogant, cruel, empty despite all his wealth, and the man he'd become, purposeful, compassionate, finally understanding that nothing he owned mattered as much as what he gave away. He thought about how close he'd come to missing all of this, because he'd been too busy being important to notice a poor boy in worn shoes, who carried more power and wisdom in his small body than Garrett had accumulated in 47 years of striving. And he thought about how one moment can change everything, how one choice to be cruel or kind can ripple out and transform worlds, how we're all just one encounter away from becoming completely different people if we're brave enough to let it happen. Thank you, Garrett said to Caleb later when the crowds had dispersed, and it was just the three of them, Caleb, Ruth, and Garrett, sitting on the foundation steps watching stars appear in the darkening sky. For what? Caleb asked. For everything. For healing me, for changing me, for showing me what actually matters. Caleb smiled and leaned against Garrett's shoulder the way he might lean against a father, comfortable and trusting. You changed yourself, Mr. Finch. I just gave you a reason to. And maybe that was the deepest truth of all, that healing wasn't just about fixing bodies, but about giving people reasons to become who they were always meant to be, that miracles opened doors, but humans had to choose to walk through them, that love could transform the world, but only if we were brave enough to let it transform us first. The story of the boy who healed a millionaire and thousands more spread far and wide, told and retold, growing into legend. But for those who lived it, the truth was simpler and more profound. That on one afternoon, A child chose love over fear, service over safety, and in doing so showed everyone watching that the impossible was just another word for what we haven't had courage to attempt yet. That ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stopped protecting themselves and started pouring themselves out. And that sometimes the greatest miracle wasn't the healing itself, but the way it changed everyone who witnessed it, turning mockery into respect, cruelty into compassion, and strangers into family bound by the shared experience of watching grace become real right in front of their eyes.